Hello, we're in for a breathtaking interview, and everyone who thinks of keeping their money in euro should listen to it most attentively, because we are going to talk with Philipp Bagus, a professor and a person who is called a young person with a huge influence. He's a libertarian economist, and his most famous work is called, at least in Ukrainian translation, The Tragedy of Euro. So, while in Ukraine, he explained his ideas to many people from the Ukrainian financial elite, and now he will be talking to the viewers of Ukrlife TV and everyone who is going to join us for their own benefit. Ukraine is aiming to join the European Union. What issues should we pay special attention to? What should we analyze, to your mind?
You should analyze the general question if you really want to join the European Union, because it comes with many disadvantages. You have to take into account that the European Union is a political project, and there are basically two different opinions how this should be done. The classical liberal idea was just to have basically a free trade zone, with free movement of capital, people, ideas. But there's also this socialist idea to have Europe like a bloc that competes with other economic blocs, and that is a fortress to the outside with tariffs, and inside strong regulation and everything centralized in Brussels, and with the final aim to have a European super state, a central state that controls all individual states, that the nation state cease to exist, and it absorbs ever more legislation power. So, I think it's not very attractive to be part of such an empire.
Well, from what you say, we may draw certain parallels of the European Union as you describe it and the Soviet Union, in which most of us have lived. And basically it's a socialist idea that, according to your assessment, lies in the basis of both unions. How is it possible now? Why the socialist idea is still there?
Yeah, that's a good question, because people don't seem to learn. Well, they changed the socialists changed their tactics after the fall of the Berlin Wall. They did not defend communism or Marxism, but they shifted their rhetoric. They now come over the strategy to protect the climate or other ideas, and they portray, of course, the European Union as well. First of all, they don't openly talk to the populations of what their real aim is. If they would do, most populations would be against this, because in the nation states they don't want the central state, and you see it with the Brexit. That the British, which are very independent, they don't want to be part of this and be ordered by Brussels. So they seem to hide the socialist and centralized idea a little bit. But again, this population in general is very also social democratic and believes in the welfare state and regulation and taxes. So this is a general idea that those politicians exploit there.
Still, many people in this country think that socialism was good. It was the realization, the implementation of socialist ideas that went wrong. So what are your chief arguments against this?
Yeah, look, this is a general thing that always happens. There are basically three phases of socialism. First of all, it's said, oh, now this will be different type of socialism, and there are actually Western pilgrims, and they go to Cuba and they go to Venezuela and say, this time it's a socialism of the 21st century, it will all be different. Then there's like the honeymoon. then there's like a kind of disillusionment when the first problems appear, like in Venezuela, And then the third phase then, oh, it was never real socialism. It was, it's always the same, so it's always the same strategy. The thing is that socialism necessarily always, for economic reasons, has the same consequences. Not only on the political side, that you can only have it with centralization. When we have centralization, you cannot have individual liberties. Hayek showed this in The Road to Serfdom, that when you have socialism, necessarily you cannot have individual liberties, and everything goes to the central agency. And economic-wise, central planning does not work, because the central planners do not have the necessary information to plan the economy. This can only be done in competition with individuals that have the information of the time and place, and with a price system. The price system is only possible if you have private property, and without prices you cannot just calculate if what you do is actually creating value or destroying value. This is the argument of economic calculation. That's impossible in socialism, that Mises showed 100 years ago. If you cannot compare, if the resources that you take, what you do with them is something more valuable, then you are basically lost, you are blind, and you can only compare this if you have prices. And in socialism you don't have prices, so you can try it again and again, and it will always necessarily have the same results, because they are basic economic laws.
From what you say, I gather that you are for doing away with the welfare state. But in a country like Ukraine, where almost 2/3 of population live on the edge of poverty, how will they survive without, let's say, free or proclaimed free medicine, without state-provided pensions and things like this? What's your point of view as a libertarian economist?
Yeah, it's of course a myth that the state is Santa Claus. It does not create new resources. So everything that we receive through the welfare state from the state, first of all, it has taken from us. It's not Santa Claus that creates something new, and like manna from heaven, it falls to us. First it takes it from us, and then it gives it to us. So then the basic question here is, do we want the state to take the resources from us, and then politicians decide how to give the services, what kind of education, what kind of healthcare services, with all the bureaucracy and the ways that it implies, or shall we rather have some control ourselves, civil society, and say, well, with these resources we want this kind of education in competition, we have different choices, and not just want the politicians say what kind of educational system and what kind of healthcare, but we ourselves decide how to use these resources. I mean, this is true, of course, if it doesn't matter if the society is rich or poor. It just means that the control of the resources is in civil society. I mean, in the Industrial Revolution, workers that were much poorer than today, people in Ukraine, they organized themselves on a voluntary basis. Kinds of social securities, they just said, well, we voluntarily, we put money in a common fund, and if someone of us becomes ill, well, out of this pool, we get some payments. But the workers had the control, the immediate control, and they could also look if the guy was really ill, and they could say, oh, these are the conditions, so long, and they had the control. But then the state expropriated these pools and instituted national healthcare and social Bismarck and the welfare states, and then suddenly politicians had control over these funds. Yeah? So the alternative is, shall workers or people have control over the funds, or the state? And Bismarck said it very clearly. We want the welfare state because we want to make them dependent, the workers dependent on the state, to have the allegiance of these people.
What you say basically reminds me of another type of socialism, the self-governed socialism.
Yeah, these were mutual aid associations, basically. Yeah, it's Well, but it's not socialism because it's voluntary. You can join one, or you don't have to. You don't have to. You can, and then it's decided how to use the funds. And then one step more, of course, is our insurance company. Insurance company is then maybe less flexible, and it's, of course, it wants to make profits, but it has the same principle. We pay in something, and then if something happens to us, well, we get money out of the insurance. Yeah. So the important thing is we don't need the state to provide these services, like healthcare or pension system, and the state at the end, it can only take the resources from society. So if the society is poor, it cannot create resources out of nothing. So the alternative is to have a competitive private system with the incentives, or to have a centralized state system where we depend on the state.
But some people would argue that a poor country and a poor society may make do with the help of a strong administrative system, and some people would quote Belarus as an example.
Of course, it's always better if you have a system that is not corrupt and where there's the rule of law in any society, in a poor or a rich one. Of course, you will only get rich if you have the right institutions. If you have corruption, it will not work. Yeah.
You mentioned Brexit at the very start of our conversation, and the next deep crisis that you predict for the European Union is the Eurozone crisis. 19 countries have renounced their national currencies in order to create this mega currency, and some people would say that euro is a strong reserve currency. So what's your assessment of this view, and also what's your advice for people in Ukraine, how they should stock their personal savings? Should they use euro or some other sort of currency?
Yeah, I think they should use gold, not fiat currencies. The problem of fiat currencies is that they can be created out of thin air. They depend on the wills of politicians, and politicians have their incentives. They want to win elections, so they indebt themselves and print money in order to win these elections, while gold cannot be corrupted. It cannot be created out of thin air. So this is always a good idea to invest on gold and not rely on fiat currencies. Yeah, and the Eurozone has this problem, as we have here several independent governments that can indirectly print money, or at least finance their deficits with one central bank, and then we get perverse incentive, because it's a tragedy of the commons. Any government can print their government bonds, give them to the ECB, and then the money supply increases and prices rise. I give always the example of a Greek politician that wants to win his election. So what he does, he permits raising pensions or other government goodies, and he does not want to raise taxes because Greek and no one likes taxes. So what he does is to just have a government deficit and issue government bonds that then are bought by the banking system, given to the ECB. The banks get new reserves, and as a consequence, the money supply increases and prices rise. But not only in Greece, but also in Italy, Spain, Germany, and France. That means that the French, Germans, Italians, and Spaniards, they pay indirectly in form of higher prices for the Greek deficit and for the higher pensions in Greece. So this is, of course, very nice for the Greek politicians because his voters get higher pensions, and foreigners that do not vote in Greek elections pay, and for part of it in form of higher prices or a loss of the purchasing power of money. So there's a high incentive to do this, and not only the Greek politician has this incentive, the Italians, the Spaniard, but you can only win in this redistribution. This is a monetary distribution that most people don't understand because it's quite complex. I try to simplify it here a little bit so you can understand it. You can only win if you do it more than others, because if the Germans maybe do it a little bit, but the others have a much higher deficit, then prices rise faster or higher then the deficit is in Germany. They knew, of course, the founders knew that there are severe problems if you have several independent governments with one central bank. They knew it, so they tried to limit this problem with the so-called Stability and Growth Pact.
Speaking of Greece and all the things Greek, your famous work is called The Tragedy of Euro. So is it a classical ancient Greek tragedy where there's someone who is on the stage and a chorus commenting on what's happening? Or is it a modern tragedy where there are several protagonists? Or maybe this is a combined genre of tragic comedy?
Yeah, actually, I called the book because of an economic concept, which is called the tragedy of the commons. Mm-hmm. It's normally applied to natural resources that can be exploited by different actors. Common example are schools of fish in the ocean. So there are many fishers. Mm-hmm. The school of fish does not belong to anyone. Anyone can fish there. So what is my incentive as a fisher? To fish as fast as possible, because if I don't, the other fisher will come and get the fish. If I get a very young fish, I won't throw it back into the water because the other guy will get it. So if the school of fish would be private property and I could only exploit the school of fish, then I would have very different incentives because I own the capital value of the school of fish. I probably would not want to have it reduced to zero. I rather will only fish so much that it can reproduce itself and maintain its size. But of course, if there are other fishers that also can use it, this disappears. Then I have to fish as fast as possible because other. And here it happens the same with the euro. You have the purchasing power of the euro, which is the commonly owned resource, and it can be exploited by several independent governments that have deficits, issue government bonds that are bought by the banks, pledged as collateral by the ECB, and then the money supply increases and prices rise. That is the purchasing power of the money of the euro falls. So therefore, there are several actors that can exploit one commonly owned resource, which is the purchasing power of the euro. So therefore, it's a tragedy of the commons that leads to overexploitation of the resource. And as an analogy, I call this the tragedy of the euro. Not so much to make reference of the classical Greek tragedies, but more to this, well, also a little bit, no? But mostly to this economic concept.
Still, if you mention different actors in this tragedy, who is the director and who is the playwright? And what is the role of spectators?
Yeah, the playwright, I make the argument that there has been a struggle between the people who want a more classical liberal Europe with just freedom of movement of ideas, people and capital. That's the classical liberal idea where we have only individual liberty, and the socialist idea. And then the socialists, they understand very well that with the euro we get strong centralizing forces. So the writer would be here the socialists who want to attain their central state, which is their final vision for Europe. How to achieve it? Well, when the Berlin Wall came down, communism collapsed. It looked like now the classical liberal vision would actually win, because there would be new states from the east coming in that were tired of empires and socialism. They would support the classical liberal side rather than the socialist side. And of course Germany, which was more prone to the classical liberal side, would also get stronger. So then the socialists, they decided to accelerate the project of the common currency, and then actually François Mitterrand, he asked in exchange for his permission to German reunification, he asked for the end of the Deutschmark and introduction of the common currency. So they, in '93, then the Maastricht Treaty was signed, and it was decided to have the common currency. And as you see, when we have this this strategy of the commons that's like different fishers that fish as fast as possible, we have a huge problem. How can you solve this then? Well, if you have a super fisher, let's say, a central authority that says, for example, quotas. That is how government fix this. Instead of privatizing the fishes, say quotas. So you fisher, you can fish 10 tons and so on. So they tried to do it actually with the Stability and Growth Pact that says you can only have 3% deficit of GDP, but there is no one who actually enforces this. There's no penalties if you fish more than you should fish, if you have higher deficits than you should have. And more than 100 times governments had more than 3%. In Greece it's sometimes even 10 or 8, many years in Southern Europe, but nothing never happened. So the only thing to solve this then becomes a central government. So you see, that's the reason why the construction of the euro pushes us towards centralization, which is the aim of the socialists. So in this sense, the socialists are the playwrights, and the individual governments are then the players.
Right. If the European Union is not something that Ukraine should aspire at, then maybe there are other groups of countries or individual countries that Ukraine should look to.
Yes, most certainly. Take Norway. It's not part of the European Union, but it's part of the common market. Switzerland is not part of the European Union, but it has access to the common market. So the great advantage of the European Union is, of course, to have a free exchange, free trade. No? So if the ideal thing is, of course, to achieve free trade without having Brussels with its regulations and harmonization of tax rates and the euro. Because nowadays, if you say that you will join the euro, you necessarily sign that you later on you will also. If you sign to join the EU, you also have to sign the clause that you have to join later the euro. So it's not.
But some countries have been without euro for 15 years or so.
Yeah, but this was before, like Denmark or the UK. They were before the Maastricht Treaty. They were within the EU, and then they said, "Okay, we won't sign this. We stay outside." But every new country that nowadays comes in, they come in with the condition.
What's the span? I mean, Poland and Bulgaria and other countries. No, Bulgaria is already in Europe, but Poland and some other countries are still retaining their own currency.
Yeah, they are, because there are these. Of course, there must be also some will of the government in the Czech Republic and Poland. I guess now there's not much will. Plus, there are these conditions that you have to fulfill, which are the Maastricht criteria, which is to have inflation, some inflation criteria, debt criteria, deficit criteria, exchange rates, stability. So, and if you don't fulfill this, you don't have to join.
And of course, if you don't want to join, then you may manipulate with those criteria and not to fulfill them intentionally.
Yeah, that's what I recommend actually. Mm-hmm. But I mean, most of the times it's good to fulfill them. But what you could do is what did Greece, but the other way around. Greece falsified its criteria, its statistics, inflation statistics, in order to get into the euro. So what a country like Poland or Ukraine then could do is to say, well, to falsify the statistics and say we have a government deficit of 10%, mm-hmm. while in reality it's a balanced budget.
On the other hand, there's a country that is not part of the European Union but runs euro as its currency, Montenegro. Mm-hmm. I mean, what are the traps in this situation?
Yeah, you tie yourself to a sinking ship. No? You're using. Mm-hmm.
So you're very pessimistic. The sinking ship.
Yeah.
And the school of fish around it.
Yeah. The Swiss did also a currency peg for some mm-hmm. time with the euro, and then they decided, no, we should not be tie us to the ship, because I mean They know perfectly what are the problems in the Eurozone, that the Euro crisis is not over, that we may have a banking crisis in Europe, which could lead again to a sovereign debt crisis, and finally the fallout of the Euro or very high inflation. So it's dangerous to play with fire. I mean, this is not a good currency at all. And there are, of course, much better alternatives. Yeah.
Like?
Yeah, gold.
Gold, again, yeah. Gold. What about cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, cryptocurrencies are also a possibility, yeah. I mean, they cannot be manipulated by governments either. I personally like gold, but cryptocurrencies are also possible.
Could do with some bitcoins.
Yeah.
All right. From what I heard, I have an impression that you absolutely do not believe that a strong state may work for the benefit of the society. And could you recuperate on this and just sum up why is it so, to your mind?
Because
I mean, centralized state.
It's because it's antagonistic to society, to civil society. The state can only live on what it takes from society, and the natural tendency of the state is to grow. Constitutions, we try to restrict the state with constitutions, checks and balances, but lastly it fails because it's a constitution is like a chastity belt where the lady has the key to it, because the state.
Some people maintain that this is a myth.
What?
The chastity belt.
Yeah.
Devised last century in order to scare people not to go back to medieval ages. Yeah,
I mean, the idea is that the lady has the key to the chastity belt. So it does not, because who's interpreting this constitution? Well, it's the state. State institutions, state judges that get their salary from the state. So, okay, the state divides itself into departments, but it's one institution, right? And they have a common interest that is to increase in power. More power for the state means less liberty. So it's antagonistic. The more power the state has, the less power the people have. The individuals have to make the decisions voluntarily.
Still, there are two brief questions in addition. Do you see, and if you do, then what are the signs of the coming global financial crisis? I've heard some talk about this.
Well, this can come from come from the outside, through trade wars or to a crisis in China, where we don't know how the macroeconomic conditions are really in China, if there's an unsustainable boom or what happens there. But there are certainly, what we know is that there are strong problems within Europe, the Eurozone. There are the very high government debts and deficits. Now we have good times, we have economic growth and very low interest rates for governments. But what happens if interest rates rise? Then suddenly these government debts may become unsustainable, and the banking system is full of these debts. Then we have the problem that we have had this zero interest rate or negative interest rate policy, which has led to bad investments, for malinvestments, and has maintained alive companies that with normal interest rates would die. And therefore they are called zombie companies, because they are only kept artificially alive by these low interest rates, and we are accumulating these zombie companies. And this makes the economy, well, there's less growth because they are not productive, they are not creating value. They should disappear and make space for new companies that are innovative. So this leads to a stagnation in Europe, and of course the problem that once these zombies fall, they are financed by the banking system, there will be huge losses for the banks. And finally, we have the problem of that the traditional banking business model has been destroyed by this negative interest rate policy. Mario Draghi said, we will do whatever it takes to save the euro, and he was willing to sacrifice the banking system, the classic business model of the banking system. What is it? It is to indebt yourself short term and to lend long term. So for like 20 years ago, banks would get for 1% money for 3 months and then give mortgages for 30 years for 8% maybe. So you have the spread between 1 and 8%. So now with the negative interest rate policy, what has happened is that the yield curve, that is the difference between the short run and the long run, has basically disappeared. So the spread that the banks had to make profits has disappeared, and we see this, that the profitability of the banking system is continuously falling down. Why? Because they still have old mortgages like 20, 30 years ago where they still make money. But they are, every year, this is less. And they cannot make new loans with the same interest rates. So we can foresee a little bit that the profitability of the banking system will continue to be evaporated, and at some point it will become negative, and if it becomes negative, they have losses, and there may be a banking crisis and a banking panic. So this may trigger the crisis.
During your visit to Ukraine, you've met some representatives of the Ukrainian financial elite, or at least we call those people financial elite. What's your impression how ready they are to absorb the ideas that you propose, and whether they are ready to change at all?
Look, I explained that my idea is to have a gold standard, because gold cannot be manipulated, and gold means that you have a sound currency, and it gives you institutional stability and trust in you, because it does not depend on human will. And this would mean that you get investments from foreign countries, because they want to invest in a stable currency that increases in value. People save more because they see that the currency is stable, and this would lead to a huge economic growth and investment boom. But of course, this is an ideal solution. There are strong political resistance against it, and I understand that if you are in politics, you have to be pragmatic and do what you can. And but I think to have the ideal in mind is always good, because then you know you have the direction where you should go. It's like an orientation, what you should do, and go step by step in this direction, and don't go into the other direction.
So how do you feel? Are Ukrainians set to go in this direction? Are they set to go in the direction that you suggest?
I hope so. And I think so, because they are, at least when I talk to them, they are aware of the dangers of the other direction. So I think when they can, politically, they will probably move in the right direction, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
You're very welcome.